What's going on, everyone? Jeremy here from The Quartering, and if you wonder what I thought about Picard, it wasn't very good. It was uninspired. It was everything I feared it would be, everything I predicted it would be, as more and more quotes were released by Patrick Stewart. Now, Patrick Stewart is still a beloved actor, still very good at his craft, but he's not into it anymore. He's interested in the political messaging of the television program he's in, more than the show being good. Or maybe his opinions have just changed, or his goals have just changed in life. But this is an all too relevant example of when shows are written, produced, with this kind of, even if it's not their main focus, obviously, but when they're thinking about what about representation, and what about this social issue, and what does a show say about Drumpf? What does a show say about Brexit? It ends up trash. I mean, there's innumerable examples of this. How about Doctor Who? The worst ratings in 20, 30 years on some of these episodes, universally disliked by most of the fandom. Now, does the show itself talk about Orange Man Bad? Not directly, and not, but when the writers of a show are so universally focused on this type of stuff, it clearly has a negative effect. Look at shows like Batwoman. Trash. Why? Well, the writing's bad, first of all. And you could say the same thing about Doctor Who, right? The writing in Doctor Who was very poor this year. Batwoman, very poor. Now, the budgeting between the two shows is different. I don't think people have really high expectations for a show like Batwoman in terms of CG and things like that. Same with Supergirl, right? But there is some expectation there. And you wonder if these people spent less time Orange Man banning on Twitter and more time writing a good script and worrying about character development, perhaps it would have been a better show. Now, I've said since the beginning with Picard, there are a lot of cringe, like, lol, millennials watch our show stuff. Let me give you a perfect example. The cursing in the show. It's so forced. Just the F-bombs are so out of place. I've talked about this with a lot of modern-day millennial-targeted media. That's not just television, but it's also in comic books. It just feels weird and not a place to have this type of language in it. But remember that Patrick Stewart, remember that this show absolutely had an agenda in it. Why he returned to the Final Frontier. This was all political to him. Star Trek, Picard, current, does not want to cover this other stuff going on in the population. But remember, Star Trek Picard showrunner Michael Chabon admitted he wanted to piss people off or provoke people. Showrunner admitted the comments and more came in a lengthy discussion with showrunner had with Variety to promote the final episode of Star Trek Picard. Quote, in the course of the season, we show the death of characters who was a recurring character on Voyager, and the death of Hugh, who is a recurring character on TNG, the Next Generation. We definitely had a sense of, like, this is probably going to be some people who are upset when these characters have died. He just said Isheb's saying the death of Isheb, and now I'm not familiar with that character. I didn't watch Voyager, thank God. Although some people say it's good. I don't know. I'd only ever heard bad things about it, but nonetheless. Become part of the story of 7 of 9, and it felt completely called for, and we couldn't have told her story without it. I mean, the passing was pretty upsetting, partly because it's fairly gruesome, which I understand, but also because he's so powerless. Well, all men on the show are powerless. Even Angry Joe admitted that all the men are doofs on the show, and they clearly have a female woman power agenda here. And I want to say that it's not impossible to exist in a world where you want this to happen. It's not impossible to have good writing with an emphasis on female empowerment. First 5 or 6 seasons of Game of Thrones might be a really good example of that. Characters like Daenerys Targaryen wasn't on a pedestal. She earned her power. All the female characters in that show were great examples of strong female characters that weren't necessarily Mary Sue's. But what we got with Picard was essentially Star Wars. A bunch of Mary Sue's who didn't earn their power, who disregarded and basically dumped on the lore of Picard, and it was just Picard in name only. That's what you got with the series. That's exactly what everyone expected. The quote, I don't think I quite understood that there was going to be people who would be upset about the character's death regardless of how the character died. That's simply the fact of the character dying. That was not okay with them. Even if I had known, I would ultimately dismiss it because it seems I just don't understand television in this way. He begins by saying that it probably should ignore fan reactions for a show like the number one of his Picard partners. I mean, one possible response that I could have had, and I think some of my partners on Picard do have, is to ignore all this completely, or to take a little glance, maybe look at Rotten Tomatoes, see what kind of consensus the reviews from critics have been, which has been pretty darn favorable, and sort of just leave it at that. Yes, another perfect example. A perfect example of how producing television to please critics fails. This is a very common thread in the things we talk about, for example, with comic books. People that produce comic books to get likes and retweets, and when then they fail, they blame misogyny, or they blame toxic gatekeeping, or they blame mean men, toxicity. This is the unending loop that we seem to be stuck in of self-fulfilling prophecy with bad television, and then blame men when it fails. He then revels in the pursues Reddit and Twitter. I've gone maybe half a dozen times in this season to look at Reddit. I will say the quality of comment and of criticism on Reddit is so much vastly higher than it is on Twitter. Oh, so he's a Redditor. That explains a lot. However, early in the interview, Chabon noted he was excited about fan reactions. It's been pretty exciting. I think inevitably I spent a fair amount of time looking around on Twitter and Reddit, to get a sense of people's reactions. Twitter's kind of a horrible place too, so I wasn't really encouraged to spend too much time looking around. Well, so he looks for a place where people will agree with him. It's a place that you're going to get some big brain takes. I'm surprised that he would not want Twitter. It seems like they would be really interested. Here's the quote. In the course of the season, we show... we talked about that. Sorry. He then added, sometimes you're motivated to have things simply because it's going to piss people off or provoke people who seem to have missed the memo just about what actually Star Trek is and what it's all about. Using like the literal Reddit meme. Actually, ASHTKUTLLY kind of meme. I don't understand how you can just discount. I mean, fan reaction is not good. You have a show where Picard is essentially a shell of himself, simply an empty vessel for them to push modern politics in it. You talk about, where's that article that I read? I feel like there was something in here. I feel like, oh yeah, here. In a way, the world of Next Generation had been too perfect and too protected, he says. It was the Enterprise. It was a safe world of respect and communication and care, and sometimes fun. In Picard, the Federation, a union of planets bonded by the shared democratic values, has taken an isolationist turn. The new show, Stewart says, was me responding to the world of Brexit and Trump. And feeling, why hasn't the Federation changed? Why hasn't Starfleet changed? Maybe they're not reliable and trustworthy as we all thought. He talks about Brexit, Trump, driving his decision to make this show. Is it any surprise that hardcore fans of this show strongly dislike it? Now, the writing itself is probably the worst part. You can look at the reviews. Contrived, boring, uninteresting characters, lots of plot holes. Picard was a strong, regimented, and moralistic leader. So sad to see his character reduced to being told off by every character every single episode. It was awful. It sure wasn't Star Trek either. The show does not even get its own stuff right. So even the most basic robots with AI are banned. So much more refined holographic AIs are allowed. What? I mean, that we're getting some real big-brained criticism here. A 60%, and we don't even know because we know Rotten Tomatoes oftentimes will scrub these reviews. And you don't know. You don't really know. Awful, just awful writing, flagrant disregard for the developing believable sci-fi plot devices, and more interested in mysticism, superstition, religion, projecting all the worst parts of the world today into the future. Isn't that interesting? Not a very interesting story, see-through plot, characters acting weird, not like Star Trek at all. Maybe that's because the beginning motivation for a guy like Patrick Stewart to come back was politically motivated, was about making a statement. He goes on to say, real world parallels are not hard to identify. So the article does. It is 1 week before the parliamentary election that we will see British Prime Minister and Brexit hardliner Boris Johnson, Conservatives win a staggering victory over Labour rivals. And Stewart is not feeling optimistic about the near future. Quote, I'm not sure which one of us is in the most trouble, he says of the Britain and the United States. I think it's actually the UK. I think we've effed up. We're completely effed. He points to studies predicting decades-long economic damage. This is where his headspace was on the cusp of 80 years old, to resurrect the character that so many people loved. This was his motivation, and this is the product you get. A universally loved character that divides the fans, a showrunner that seek to cause disruption, dismay among the fandom. This is nothing more, nothing less than a pure cash grab that spat on the history of the next generation. And anybody who follows this channel saw it coming from a mile away, but that doesn't mean I won't report on it. That means I won't continue to call it out. And I appreciate all of you participating by crushing that like button, leaving your comments in the comment section down below. We'll talk to you again real soon.